Conflicts that Shaped Pharaonic Egypt, Lecture 3, Unity in a Multicultural Society.
At the beginning of the NAQADA I period, around 4000 BCE, almost a millennium before Egypt possessed a single ruler and a centralized state, the cultures of Upper Egypt traded with groups inhabiting the deserts to the south and the west, the latter frequenting seasonal lakes and engaged in a blend of hunting, gathering, and pastoralism. This interaction between the inhabitants of the desert and those of the Upper Egyptian Nile Valley fueled the development of a complex and symbol-oriented culture that would become what we know as Pharaonic Egypt. Over time, the power centers of Upper Egypt became cultically and economically interrelated, even homogeneous. Whereas by the beginning of the NAQADA I period in Upper Egypt, the Nile Valley is essentially culturally and technologically homogeneous, with certain local characteristics, the Delta is more or less a patchwork of groups, all geographically more limited and technologically less developed than their Upper Egyptian counterparts. During the NAQADA II period in the south, the period Petrie called Gerzean, circa 3500 to 3250 BCE, many momentous changes occur in Upper Egyptian culture. During the NAQADA II period, two new types of pottery appear. Petrie's R-ware, or rough ware, and D-ware, or decorated ware. R-ware, rough ware, is chaff-tempered pottery. Perhaps invented at Hierakonpolis in the south during the late NAQADA II period, sometimes called the NAQADA II C/D. This allowed for the rapid production of rather rough but often thick-walled, sturdy ceramic vessels, just what you need for increased trade, both in terms of distance and quantity. During the middle of the NAQADA II period, what we often call NAQADA IIB, marl clay also appears in Upper Egypt. The fabric, the type of clay out of which Petrie's D-ware is made. Marl clay, as opposed to silt, is a desert clay. Marl is made of materials from the desert. Silt is made from the black alluvial soil of the Nile. The groups making pottery during the 9th millennium BCE in the early stages of the North African Neolithic were employing the ceramic materials available to them in their local environments. Some of these ultimately look like the later marls, some look like the later silts, some appear to be mixtures. We don't always understand the exact recipes that were used by the potters in making those clays to make their pots. But for Upper Egypt, during the NAQADA II period, we see the development of new ceramic technologies, recipes that were devised and that were passed on and that could be imitated by potters all up and down the Upper Egyptian Nile Valley. Marl clay during the NAQADA IIB period rests on a technique of adding crushed calcium carbonate to the silt matrix of the pot. The calcium salts aided in the vitrification process and produced a hard pink to orange colored fabric, sometimes called hard pink, sometimes called hard orange. These technological innovations sweep through Upper Egypt. Now the Upper Egyptians have a great technique for making often thick-walled, rough and ready, even disposable transport and storage vessels, and a way at producing a very hard polishable pottery that in many ways, even in its shape, will imitate stone vessels. Upper Egypt now is technologically, at least in terms of ceramic technology, on a level far superior to that of Lower Egypt. Sure enough, in Lower Egypt, there are attempts at copying Upper Egyptian artware, using flax as a tempera on some occasions, but these are generally unsuccessful. Another important aspect of these ceramic technological innovations in Upper Egypt is the fact that the marl pottery was called by Petrie deware, or decorated ware. It is, in fact, almost always decorated. A marl with an often black or brownish black decoration. These may, many of them, be ritual vessels. Some of the decoration is abstract, but often, one might say most often, depicts ritual boats with shrines on the deck. Also with groups that do not appear to be random associations. So, for instance, on many deware vessels, you will see a female figure rather stiffly posed with her arms curved above her head, next to the image of a quadruped, often an addax. The one seems to summon the other. They seem to form a pair and are associated with the religious shrines on the decks of the boats depicted on the deware pottery. A recent study has suggested that these women represent female ritualists, perhaps dancers of an association called the Acacia House that was associated with ritual butchers. These female figures with associated addax together hieroglyphically represent and call forth the concept of ritual sacrifice. During the NAQADA II period, in rock art, in the eastern and western deserts of Upper Egypt, we also see the birth of the predecessors, the iconographic harbingers of Egyptian writing. In Lower Egypt, at the same time, at Mahdi, between about 3750 and 3200 BCE, we see the presence of foreign Syro-Palestinian traders, apparently. Underground houses at Mahdi appear to be those of Palestinians living in the area and are similar to structures we see at Beersheba. These probably belong to resident aliens, and in fact foreshadow something we will see in a later lecture occurring in late Middle Kingdom, Avaris, in the northeastern delta. Mahdi also reveals the presence of underground storage cellars and large pots, enormous pithoi, some perhaps for storing grain, but others for storing other objects. We see a great many stone vessels, so many, some even as blanks, not quite finished, that they appear to be objects of trade more than local use. The Mahdi cultures of the Delta, in the eastern Delta, certainly have stronger ties with the Syro-Palestinian area than with Upper Egypt. At Buto, in the Delta, we get copies of ceramic forms and decorations that we know from the southern Negev. But this is rather rapidly abandoned, and the relatively unsophisticated Delta techniques return. The Delta cultures are trading partners with Syria-Palestine. We might expect this. What is interesting is that we seem to see the outer Western Asiatic cultures coming to the Nile Delta more than we seem to see the Nile Delta, the Egyptians themselves, engaged in long-distance trade. This becomes all the more remarkable when we see what the Upper Egyptians are doing at the same time. During what we call the early Bronze I in Syria-Palestine, Between about 3500 and 3300 BCE, NAQADA II Upper Egyptians have formed a colony living with the local people at Tel Arani, west of Lachish. Tel Arani may in fact have been a colonial capital, and at many other early Bronze I sites like Beersheba, we see Egyptian material, and specifically Upper Egyptian material. And we get this as far north as Megiddo. We see Upper Egyptian influence on urbanization in southern Syria-Palestine. The site of Beersheba appears to have grown up as a fortified well for caravans along trade routes, ultimately with Egypt, and imported Upper Egyptian pottery may still to this day be found on the surface of the Beersheba site. The Upper Egyptians, not the Lower Egyptians, not the closer Delta folk, are establishing trade colonies and are sending long-distance caravans into Syria-Palestine. In the years following 3500 BCE, we see Upper Egypt projecting itself past Lower Egypt, both onto Lower Egyptian culture, being adopted in Lower Egyptian culture, and at the same time, we see the Upper Egyptians themselves going out, leapfrogging over the Lower Egyptians, setting up their own colonies, managing their own trade in Syria-Palestine, cutting out the would-be middlemen of the Nile Delta. Interestingly, this Upper Egyptian expansion occurs almost at the same time as Mesopotamian cultures began to project themselves through the Fertile Crescent over the middlemen of Syria during the Uruk expansion. During the NAQADA II period in Upper Egypt, we see not only a technological unification, we see through the archaeological remains on the various desert roads interconnecting the various sites of Upper Egypt and linking them with points beyond in the eastern and western desert, we see the economic interdependence of various points in Upper Egypt. Politically, we have no indication that there is one power. We have, in fact, every indication that by 3250 BCE, Upper Egypt consisted of three major power centers: Abydos to the north, the NAQADA region in the middle, centered in the area of the Great Kenna Band and located itself not far from modern Luxor, and Hierakonpolis in the south between Luxor and Aswan. Nevertheless, in spite of political differences, in terms of the wide-ranging technological changes that we see in Upper Egypt during the NAQADA II period, and in terms of the pervasive and repeated iconographic elements that we see both in decorated pottery and in rock art, we see that Upper Egypt is economically, technologically, and ideologically becoming a monolithic whole before there is any unification of any large portion of the Egyptian Nile Valley or Delta. What this means is that the political unification of Upper Egypt that occurs at the end of the NAQADA II period is the last event. It is the final fruit that drops from the NAQADA I, NAQADA II tree of developing cultural and economic interdependence. During the NAQADA II period, we not only see decorated pottery, but we see a great amount of rock art in the desert areas. Wherever ancient Egyptian caravan roads travel between points of water, they must go up and down the desert escarpment. Remember that the water sources in Egypt are all in some sort of depression, be it the Nile Valley or be it the oases of the Western Desert. In order to go up and to go down, that's actually what the Egyptians call a desert trip sometimes. Ramses II refers to Chezi Hai in one of his inscriptions, going up and going down, as a way of referring to a desert journey. The beginning and the end of the journey is going up onto the high desert and then ultimately going down off that desert. Wherever these roads go past the desert surface, past the rocky surface of the Jebel as we call it in Arabic, the ancient Egyptians liked to leave inscriptions. But they didn't do it just anywhere. They didn't roam around looking for good stone. They left their inscriptions in the best stone they could find that was at a point where they knew that another traveler would see what they had written. And interestingly enough, by the NAQADA II period, we begin to see the repetition of certain images over and over in the rock art. Some of these images are like what we see in the decorated pottery, but they're made in a slightly different way. So already in the NAQADA II period, we have a painterly style of iconography, and we have a carved style of iconography. At rock art sites, during already the NAQADA I period, we see what you can call iconographic attraction. Later travelers, coming the next day, coming the next year, coming a decade later, see the rock art of an earlier traveler and they produce their own. And rock art of a particular type, a certain type of boat, images of a hippopotamus, let's say, rock art of a particular image will tend to cluster either at a certain site or within a discrete area of a larger site. This we might term iconographic attraction. At the same time, we see that certain images, if we group them together, evoke something much larger. The image of a woman may simply depict a woman. The image of an addax may simply depict that desert beast. But a woman with an addax close to a shrine, as depicted on the decorated pottery, that is something different. That is the woman and the addax equaling the sacrificial animal and the ritual of sacrifice. Not simply the butchering, but the women who chanted the songs accompanying the ritual sacrifice. The woman and the addax mean ritual sacrifice. During the NAQADA II period, we begin to see people grouping images not simply of like kind, but developing a certain order to images. We begin to see lines of animals depicted marching one after the other, apparently an attempt to bring the natural world into the same sort of order the Egyptians are attempting to bring to their human society. And in certain of these groups, a particular separate image will occur in a certain space. For instance, in lines of animals marching one after the other by kind, the beginning of the second register of these animals often opens with the image of a waterfowl, a saddlebill stork, let's say, with a rearing serpent beneath its beak. This occurs generally in the opening of the second register. It is often followed by the sign of a giraffe, which we know from a number of rock art sites is a solar symbol for the pre-dynastic Egyptians. Now, every once in a while, an artist will use that group of saddlebill stork with serpent, followed by giraffe, and will alter the giraffe, will change the giraffe to another animal. From a variety of occurrences, we have the impression that the stork and serpent imparts the idea of victory, of triumph, of order over chaos. Now, saddlebill stork with serpent followed by giraffe ultimately can be read as the triumph of the sun, the conquest of cosmic order. But sometimes that giraffe image is replaced by another, perhaps a crocodile in a number of instances, that seems to refer more to human authority. We begin in the NAQADA II period to see a grammar of iconography where images will group together by kind, but at the same time a certain image will take on greater significance if it is paired with yet another depiction, or if it occurs in a certain space within a group of multiple images. Iconographic attraction leads, during the NAQADA II period, to a type of iconographic syntax, where images mean more than they might because of the order in which they are drawn, because of the greater groupings in which they are composed. This concept of iconographic syntax that we see as part of this increasingly symbolic culture of the NAQADA II period in Upper Egypt ultimately leads to the origin of the hieroglyphic script, the writing system of Upper Egypt, and ultimately the writing system of all of Egypt. At the end of the NAQADA II period, the cusp between NAQADA II and III, around 3250 BCE, we see the union of the various groups of Upper Egypt into what we might call a proto-pharaonic state, a state that presages in its iconography, in its symbols of power, in much of what it does, a group that presages the pharaonic state. It is, in fact, pharaonic Egypt in charge of Upper Egypt, not yet Upper and Lower Egypt. The most important center of the NAQADA II period in Egypt is the city of Hierakonpolis, the old city of the Horus Falcon, its name in Greek meaning city of the falcon. At the time of the transition from NAQADA II to NAQADA III, a shift in power occurs between Hierakonpolis in the south, which still remains an important ritual center, an important urban center, a change in power between Hierakonpolis in the south and Abydos in the north, and at the same time, the conquest of NAQADA. We know now from an elaborate rock inscription employing iconographic syntax at a place called Jebel Chauti in the middle of the great Kenna Bend of the Nile between Luxor in the southeast and Abydos in the northwest, that a king apparently calling himself Scorpion united the proto-kingdoms of Hierakonpolis, NAQADA, and Abydos to create what we often, for want of a better term, call the NAQADA III period, or for those not in the know Egyptologically somewhat more confusingly, Dynasty 0. The great rock tableau at Jebel Chauti employs depictions of human actions interspersed with earlier images from iconographic syntax and iconographic attraction. So, on the scorpion tableau, the sign of the saddle-bill stork and the rearing serpent, that symbol, that group apparently indicating victory, is followed not by the giraffe, but by the image of a human ruler brandishing a war mace over the head of his wild-haired, bound enemy whom he leads before him. Cosmic order now provides a way of indicating human order. And this is one of the key aspects of pharaonic society and pharaonic rule. We know the Egyptians see the cosmos as existing as the ultimate number of balanced pairs. An attempt at equilibrium between opposites is what the Egyptians desire. And pharaonic rule and pharaonic Egyptians' interpretation of their own history revolves around seeing this history as an eternal glorification and vindication of the triumph of order over chaos through the balancing of these opposing pairs. What Scorpion did around 3250 BCE was to unite an almost entirely unified society in all ways other than politically into a final proto-pharaonic state. At the same time, the Delta was not a unified kingdom, but we might say a confederation of cities losing control of Syro-Palestinian trade to the Upper Egyptians, who have already surpassed them in activity and in setting up of colonies in southern Syria-Palestine. In the end, following Upper Egyptian unification, Upper Egyptian culture and ultimately rule spreads over the Delta. Already outflanked in southern Syria-Palestine, with NAQADA II outposts in the area, Lower Egyptian pottery increasingly copies Upper Egyptian forms, increasingly imports Upper Egyptian material. By the NAQADA III period, the North is essentially a political unit of limited geographic scope based at Buto in the northern delta, trading primarily not by land with southern Syria, Palestine, but by sea with the North Syrian coast. Essentially a lower Egyptian maritime expansion coeval with the land-based expansion of Upper Egypt into Sinai and southern Syria, Palestine, and the Mesopotamian Uruk expansion into Syria. This is, indeed, the first international era in the ancient world. Approximately 150 years after the man calling himself Scorpion unified Upper Egypt, a ruler named Narmer completed the Upper Egyptian conquest of the Delta. The Egyptian love of dualism, however, led the victorious Upper Egyptians to portray Narmer's final subjugation of the Buto culture as the domination of an Upper Egyptian state over a corresponding and apparently equally developed Lower Egyptian state. Even though pre-dynastic Lower Egypt does not appear to have achieved the political and symbolic sophistication of Upper Egypt, and even though we do not seem to see Buto perceiving itself as dominating, as controlling a unified delta, in the way that we see the Upper Egyptian rulers based and buried at Abydos, quite conscious of the fact that they are the rulers of Dynasty Zero, that they are the rulers of a unified proto-pharaonic state. Narmer began around 3100 BCE the long history of pharaonic kingship, which would endure for the following 3 millennia. Modern divisions of Egypt's long history derive in large part from the Greco-Egyptian historian Manetho, who used earlier Egyptian records, king lists, and other historical sources in writing a history of Egypt for her new Ptolemaic rulers. Manetho divided the history of Egypt into dynasties, grouped by a rather loose combination of city origin for the rulers and family relationships. He begins the first dynasty with the conquest of the Delta by the first pharaoh, whom he calls Menes. For this reason, since we now know there to have been a proto-pharaonic state in charge of all of Upper Egypt, giving rise to all those things, including the regalia we so well known from pharaonic Egypt, we now term the NAQADA III period Petrizol-Semanian Dynasty Zero. Prior to the first millennium BCE, 3 series of powerful dynasties ruled over a unified Upper and Lower Egypt. And Egyptologists tend to refer to these as the Old Kingdom, dynasties 4 to 6, the Middle Kingdom, dynasties 11 to 13, and the New Kingdom, dynasties 18 to 20. These kingdoms are times of centralization and powerful pharaohs, and as you will have noted already, with the absence of certain numbers of dynasties within those periods, these kingdoms are interspersed with so-called intermediate periods, when the country fragmented into smaller political units. Beginning with the late pre-dynastic period, Upper Egypt became the home of a particularly strong concept of centralized governmental authority. And during the various cycles of political weakness in the Egyptian Nile Valley, Upper Egypt is almost always the point of origin for those who desire the reestablishment of a strong, centralized pharaonic state. When there is conflict with outside groups, when there are influxes of foreigners coming out of the ancient Near East, the Delta is the home of accommodation, or what the Upper Egyptians would no doubt have called collaboration. One of the most important things that Narmer and the Upper Egyptians do when they take over finally the Delta is they create a past for the Lower Egyptians that the Lower Egyptians themselves had not actually enjoyed. Narmer already and his successors depict proper rule by the true ruler of Egypt as the uniting of Upper and Lower Egypt, bringing together of two things a balanced pair of opposites that must form a whole. Narmer refers, on a few monuments, to the subjugation of the north. It is clear on the famous Narmer palette that Delta people are there being conquered. But even on that monument, Narmer shows himself alternately as ruler of Upper Egypt and as ruler of Lower Egypt. One of the ways he does this is by the crowns, the high, mitre-like, almost bowling pin-looking white crown of Upper Egypt appears on Narmer's head on one side. On the other side, the red crown with its distinct high pointed rear section and forward curving curl, the red crown evoking Lower Egypt. Interestingly enough, the first evidence we have for the red crown comes from a pre-dynastic pot in Upper Egypt. We have no evidence that the red crown was early a symbol of any authority in Lower Egypt. We know it for Upper Egypt. Narmer pretends to unite two equal units, Upper and Lower Egypt. And apparently the Upper Egyptians even assign an aspect of earlier Upper Egyptian regalia, the red crown, to be the totemic image of the ruler of Lower Egypt. At the dawn of the pharaonic state, Narmer sets in play and acts out one of the most important things for understanding how the Egyptians present their history to us. The concept, as Eric Hornung has formulated it, of history as festival. Narmer is not subjugating losing enemies. He's bringing together with his home territory an enemy territory that is not primarily an enemy, not primarily a bad guy, but a half that obstreperously has gone its own way and has to be brought back in the fold so that both halves may become greater than themselves in the whole of the pharaonic state. One of the earliest monuments of Narmer is an elaborately carved monumental mace head from Hierakonpolis, showing the celebration of a great pharaonic ritual. Narmer sits atop a stepped dais in a large enclosure. Animal sacrifice goes on. Prisoners are brought in. There's that love of dichotomy for the Egyptians again. Hunting, bringing order out of natural chaos, is equated with warfare, a ritualized human hunting, bringing order out of chaos. What this means for the Egyptians is that those who die in properly executed battles, their deaths even the deaths of the enemies, take on a meaning as a type of ritual sacrifice in this ritualized confirmation of the triumph of order over chaos. It is more important for the ancient Egyptians to demonstrate, to understand historical events as manifestations of the assurance of this ultimate equilibrium of the cosmos than it is for them to take personal credit for something they did. Now, we will see by the end of the Old Kingdom, by the end of the 3rd millennium BCE, private people are taking credit for a lot of things, but the king takes a long time to catch up because always for the Egyptians, the pharaoh's primary duty is to be one with his predecessors, to do as they did and to enact these rituals of history as festival, not to beat their chests and point to themselves as me, and I. This is why we know so very little personally about the early rulers of Egypt. What follows the unification of Egypt under Narmer is what we generally refer to as the archaic period of the first 3 dynasties, the first phase of the Old Kingdom. In the next lecture, we will look at the Old Kingdom proper, more specifically the Pyramid Age, and what this tells us both about Pharaonic culture and perhaps more importantly, what the development of the pyramid complexes and their associated agricultural areas have to say for the development economically and politically of all of Egypt.
This ends Lecture 3.